Portugal has enacted a controversial new law largely prohibiting people from concealing their faces in public spaces, a move that has immediately reignited debate across Europe over religious freedom, women's rights, national identity, public safety and integration. The measure, commonly described as Portugal's Burqa law, was signed into law by President António José Seguro after making its way through the Portuguese parliament. According to reports, the legislation broadly prohibits clothing or coverings intended to conceal a person's face or prevent identification in public spaces. While the law is widely viewed as affecting the wearing of full-face Islamic garments such as the burqa and niqab, the legislation is written more broadly and does not simply ban one particular religious garment. Instead, it focuses on face concealment and the ability to identify a person in public. The new law places Portugal among a number of European countries that have adopted restrictions on full-face coverings in public. But the issue remains deeply controversial, with supporters arguing that such measures promote security, social integration and equality, while critics warn that governments are restricting individual liberty and religious expression. According to reports, Portugal's new rules contain several important exceptions. Face coverings may still be permitted for health reasons, professional activities, artistic performances and protection from severe weather. The restrictions also reportedly do not apply in certain settings, including places of worship, diplomatic missions and aboard aircraft. Those found violating the law could face significant financial penalties. According to reports, fines can range from approximately €150 to €3,000, depending on the circumstances of the violation. The legislation also reportedly goes beyond simply restricting face concealment. It prohibits forcing another person to cover their face because of factors such as gender, religion, age, or origin. Supporters of that provision argue that the law is intended not only to regulate public identification, but also to protect individuals from being compelled to wear clothing against their will.
Adventure starts with the right gear, and it all starts at shackshop.us. From stylish women's swimsuits and premium camping tents to paddleboards, underwater drones, and dependable dinghies, we have everything you need for your next outdoor adventure. Whether you're exploring the water or relaxing on shore, gear up with quality products at unbeatable prices. Visit shackshop.us today and make every adventure.
A law years in the making, the political fight over face coverings in Portugal did not emerge overnight. The proposal was introduced amid a broader European debate over immigration, cultural integration, religious expression, and national security. According to reports, the Portuguese parliament gave final approval to the measure in July before it was sent to the president for consideration. The proposal had drawn political divisions, with supporters arguing that Portugal should establish clear standards for public identification and social interaction. Opponents questioned whether the government should have the authority to dictate what individuals may wear in public, particularly when religious beliefs are involved. After reviewing the measure, President Seguro ultimately decided to enact it. According to reports, the president acknowledged the sensitivity of the issue and the difficulty of balancing competing rights and responsibilities. However, he concluded that concerns involving social integration, gender discrimination and security supported allowing the legislation to become law. The decision represents a significant moment for Portugal, a country that historically has not been as closely associated with debates over Islamic face coverings as some other European nations. Nevertheless, Portugal is now entering a wider European conversation that has been growing for years. Why face coverings have become a major European debate across Europe, the debate over burqas and niqabs has often involved several competing arguments. One argument centers on security and identification. Supporters of restrictions say authorities, businesses, and members of the public must sometimes be able to identify the people they are interacting with. A completely concealed face, they argue, can create problems for law enforcement, transportation, banking, security checks, and other everyday situations. Another argument focuses on communication and social integration. Supporters of face covering restrictions often argue that seeing another person's face plays an important role in human communication. Facial expressions can convey emotion, intention, and meaning. Some advocates believe that a society built around open interaction has a legitimate interest in requiring faces to remain visible in many public settings. But the issue becomes far more complicated when religion enters the discussion. For women who voluntarily choose to wear a full face covering as part of their religious beliefs, a legal ban can be viewed as government interference with personal freedom and religious practice. Critics argue that a government should not tell a woman that she cannot wear a particular garment simply because the majority finds it unfamiliar or disagrees with the beliefs behind it. That conflict between personal liberty and government regulation sits at the center of Portugal's new law. Supporters point to women's rights. One of the most significant arguments behind the legislation involves gender equality. Supporters say there is an important difference between a person freely choosing what to wear and a person being pressured or forced to wear something because of family, cultural, or religious expectations. According to reports, Portugal's legislation specifically includes provisions against compelling someone to conceal their face because of gender, religion, age, or origin. For supporters, that provision is central to the purpose of the law. They argue that no woman should be forced to cover her face against her wishes. In their view, the state has a responsibility to protect people from coercion, particularly when social or family pressure may make it difficult for an individual to refuse. However, critics respond that the issue is not so simple. They argue that banning a woman from wearing a garment she voluntarily chooses can also take away her personal autonomy. From that perspective, replacing family pressure with government pressure does not necessarily increase freedom. The disagreement highlights one of the most difficult questions surrounding the law: who gets to decide whether a particular choice is truly voluntary? Religious freedom concerns. Portugal's new law is also expected to generate questions about religious liberty. The burqa and niqab are not worn by all Muslim women, and practices vary significantly between countries, communities, and individuals. A hijab, which generally covers the hair but leaves the face visible, is different from a niqab or burqa that can conceal most or all of the face. The new Portuguese restrictions are aimed primarily at face concealment, meaning they do not amount to a blanket ban on every form of Islamic head covering. That distinction is important. A woman wearing a headscarf that leaves her face visible would generally not fall into the same category as someone wearing a garment specifically designed to conceal her face or prevent identification. Still, critics argue that because full-face Islamic garments are among the most obvious examples of clothing affected by the law, the practical consequences will fall disproportionately on a very small religious minority. That has led to concerns that the law could contribute to discrimination or social isolation. A woman who wishes to continue wearing a full face covering may now face a difficult choice between changing her clothing, limiting her activities in public, or potentially facing a financial penalty. Supporters, meanwhile, maintain that the law applies to face concealment rather than targeting one religion alone. Exceptions are a major part of the law. The Portuguese law is not an absolute prohibition on every type of face covering. According to reports, exceptions exist for medical reasons. This could include masks or other protective equipment used because of illness, infection control, or medical treatment. Professional circumstances are also included among the exceptions. Workers may need to cover their faces because of safety requirements or the nature of their jobs. Artistic performances are another exception, allowing actors, performers, and others to use costumes or masks in appropriate settings. Weather-related face protection is also reportedly permitted. In cold, dangerous, or otherwise extreme conditions, individuals may still cover their faces for protection. The law also recognizes exceptions for specific locations or situations, including places of worship, diplomatic facilities, and air travel. These exceptions demonstrate that the legislation is aimed at regulating face concealment in ordinary public life, rather than imposing an absolute ban on masks or facial coverings under every circumstance. The question will now be how those exceptions are interpreted and enforced. Enforcement could become the next major controversy. Passing a law is one thing. Enforcing it consistently is another. Portuguese authorities may now have to determine exactly what constitutes unlawful face concealment in different situations. Police officers and other officials could potentially face complicated questions involving religious practice, medical needs, weather conditions, protests, costumes, and personal privacy. Critics may also question whether enforcement could disproportionately affect certain communities. If the law is technically neutral, but is primarily enforced against Muslim women wearing niqabs or burqas, opponents could argue that its real-world application is discriminatory. Supporters are likely to counter that the law applies equally to everyone, and that enforcement should focus on whether a person's face is concealed in a prohibited public setting, regardless of religion or cultural background. The actual implementation of the law may therefore become just as important as the legislation itself. Portugal joins a wider European trend. Portugal's decision did not occur in isolation. Several European countries have previously adopted restrictions involving full face coverings in public or in specific settings. Those laws have frequently been challenged in court and debated by human rights organizations, religious groups, and political leaders. European legal decisions have generally recognized that governments may, under certain circumstances, place limits on face concealment when pursuing objectives such as public safety, social interaction, or identification. Supporters of Portugal's new law point to those legal precedents as evidence that the measure can coexist with broader protections for individual rights. But every country has its own constitution, legal traditions, and social circumstances. A policy that is accepted in one European nation can remain highly controversial in another. Portugal's new law is therefore likely to be tested not only politically, but potentially through legal challenges and public debate. What happens now? With the law enacted, attention will shift from the political battle over passage to the practical reality of implementation. Portuguese residents and visitors will need to understand when face coverings are prohibited and when exceptions apply. Authorities will have to establish enforcement procedures that clearly distinguish between unlawful concealment and legitimate uses involving health, employment, religion, artistic performances, or weather. The legislation could also become part of Portugal's larger political debate over immigration, integration, and national identity. For supporters, the law represents a statement that public life requires openness, visibility, and the ability to identify one another. They argue that the measure supports security, social cohesion, and gender equality. For opponents, the law raises a different concern: whether a free society should permit the government to regulate personal clothing choices, particularly when those choices are connected to religious belief. Both sides frame their arguments around freedom. One side argues that freedom includes the right to live in a society where people are not forced to conceal themselves and where individuals can interact openly. The other argues that freedom includes the right of an individual to choose what to wear without government interference. Portugal has now chosen a side in that legal and political debate, at least for the moment. The country's new restrictions on public face coverings mark a major policy change and place Portugal firmly within one of Europe's most contentious cultural discussions. Whether the law ultimately strengthens social integration and public confidence, or instead creates new divisions and legal disputes, remains to be seen. What is certain is that the debate over Portugal's so-called Burqa law is far from over. According to reports, the legislation is now in force, bringing new restrictions, substantial potential fines, and a renewed argument over the difficult balance between security, equality, religious liberty, and personal freedom.